And we're live. Hi, everyone.
Right.
Welcome to
Hi.
another episode of Inside.net. And I'm really excited for two reasons. One, this is the first stream that Alana and I are doing for the year.
Yes.
So happy about that. We finally got it together. And two, my friend Bill is here. And Bill, I haven't seen you for, I feel it's been at least over a year.
It has. It's been
It's
some
been a long
time.
time. So definitely glad that you were able to make some time and join us today.
Yeah, thank you.
So what we're going to talk about today, which I think is actually kind of fitting, is .NET is such an ever growing ecosystem of stuff, and there's languages and frameworks, and there's cloud things and IDE things, and there's just like stuff upon stuff upon stuff. And for folks that are maybe like you're new to .NET, or you're just you're trying to update some of your skills, or you're an architect or senior engineer, whatever the case is, like, how do I learn the new stuff? How do I begin learning .NET? You know what I mean? And then, like, how much of it do I have to learn to consider myself to be a competent .NET developer? So these are some of the things we want to talk about today. Feel free to go ahead and drop your questions in the chat. We'll be looking at those randomly to make sure that, if you have something important to ask, we'll check those out. But other than that, like, we'll just go ahead and get started. Right? Does that sound good?
Yeah, let's have fun.
So Elahn, one of the things that you and I were talking about, not last week, maybe like the week before, a couple of weeks ago, was, we both learned .NET differently.
Yes.
I grew up, like I learned .NET self-taught in college because, when I was in college, they never taught .NET. I actually don't know if they teach .NET in colleges today, but when I was in college, they did. But I was self-taught, and I got a book that was like super thick, right? I remember it was one of those red and white Rocks programming books, if you remember Rocks Publishing. And, they had people's faces on it, and it was like 1,000 and change pages. But that's how you learned, right? Like some of my textbooks in school were like that thick. They're like thousands and thousands of pages. But for me, like there was no Twitter, right? There was no YouTube. Blogging was, I guess, just kind of getting started. Like, but blogging wasn't like a normal thing to do.
Yeah.
At least not for software developers. So for me, it was very much of a manual grind, you know what I mean? And like, self-experimentation to kind of learn how the thing works. And then I feel like even after that, like, okay, I learned this language. Like, what am I going to do with it now? Right? Again, like there's no cloud. There's no, there's not a lot of stuff. And I just know how to write console applications. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And now when I think about it, contrary to I feel like your perspective now, like, you've got YouTube and you've got Twitch and you've got Pluralsight and LinkedIn Learning, and we have Discord communities and so on and so on and so on and so on. There's GitHub. Like I should go on GitHub and I can search for code and search for examples, right?
Yeah.
So like I feel like your learning perspective of mine is a little bit different.
Most definitely. And I will say, like I am fortunate to learn and to have those resources, like Twitter, and to discover a community where I can ask people for help if I need help. And I will say, like, one thing I did have to learn, because I am self-taught and I learned it through Udemy and YouTube, is also like being okay with reaching out to community. So like relying on that community, it's almost like, we shouldn't pressure ourselves to learn everything by ourselves, especially when the resources are out there. So that's just kind of something that I've had to learn. I may have had those resources like YouTube, Udemy. There's an app called Coding Game where you can learn how to code C# like in a game format. So there are resources, and I will say it's also, we're in such an important time and a beneficial time where, since we have these collaborative platforms, it's even better to, reach out to other people. So yeah, we've had very different experiences.
No, for sure.
Yeah.
So Bill, for you, I'd love to hear like your, perspective. Like how did you learn C#? Was it like your first programming language, or language 10, 11, 12 down the line? Like, what was that beginning of .NET like for you?
So for me, the beginning of .NET, it was probably, I think, my fourth or fifth professional programming language. So when I didn't learn in college, right? So if I go back to when I was in college in the 80s, we used C for a lot of things. Numerical analysis was still taught in Fortran. There were a couple in assembly language. Pascal and something called Path Pascal was pretty popular for trying to do some multi-threaded simulations. And then professionally, Pascal, then C, then C++.
Oh, wow.
A little bit of assembler here and there. And then after C++, Java, along with some JavaScript, and then C#, and then JavaScript, some of that at the same time. And then also, like, honestly, some shell programming, right? Whether it be, old Unix shells or PowerShell, are also, good ways to write stuff. So my first taste of C#, honestly, was I was writing a C++ fundamentals column for Visual C++ Developers Journal. And I got the PDC bits of the pre-release of C# 1.0. And I pitched and said, I want to try this and I want to start going in this direction. So I started writing a column for C# basically when it first came out. And yes, I see Lisp in there. So I went to school at Illinois in Champaign, which was the computer science program was grounded in hardware. So there were very, very few functional languages because at that point, the functional languages were not as they're super elegant theoretically, but the power in the hardware at that time just wasn't there. So it was like, if you want to do really elegant math things, go do that. If you actually want to write programs that can run on real machines, then we're going to do it this way.
Right.
And it is really interesting to see things, how they've evolved now, where we see functional concepts in a lot of languages now. And the hardware speed and memory size is there to make those concepts work a lot better.
Yeah.
They are a lot more practical now than they were, almost 40 years ago now.
Yeah. And I'm sure that tooling too made a big difference in terms of how much time you spent learning the thing, right?
Right.
Because, again, I remember thinking about my experience, took me hours to install Visual Studio.
Oh my goodness.
You know what I mean? I would sit down, I'd click the thing. It took a long time to download. And then after it downloaded, it had to install and components and extensions and yada, yada, yada. So I remember as a professional developer, it would generally take me about a day just to set up a machine.
Yeah.
Right? And that's not learning. That's just like getting started to do stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we have VS Code and like all these other things, or now we can write .NET in the terminal and stuff like that. So it makes it a little bit easier for us to kind of just get started.
Sharplab.io.
Yeah, exactly. Right. You can write in the browser, like all these different types of. You can write it in Docs, right? Like the Docs has like an interactive, an interactive experience as well. That's inside of it.
Yeah.
But when you were learning C# or just programming in general, like what were some of the resources you used to learn?
Oh,
like,
wow.
In books too, or did you just?
When I started, it was a lot of books and it was a lot of just trying things on my own. Back in that day when you this PC walked into our house and it was like I was going to do something with it. And started to write programs. Like in high school, I was writing programs in BASIC, right? Because that's the interpreter that came along with the machine. And this was fun. Making this machine do something. So it was. It's really been a mix, which is why I really like what I do now, because we have so many different ways to teach things. So yes, there was a lot of reading books. There was a lot of trying to come up with programs I wanted to use so I could write something myself. Trying to learn that. Some of the things that just really hasn't changed. And, now that hopefully more pandemic concerns start easing and continue to ease, going to conferences, going to local user groups and meetups and asking people questions and listening to what people are trying to teach and learning new techniques there was always really a good way to both, meet more people who are interested in this, have good conversations and learn new techniques.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, for sure. Mm-hmm. One of the things I think that's really important sometimes is to have like a learning strategy, or I call it a learning strategy, right? And it's very similar to like probably like some of the other things you do in your life, right? Like when I go to the gym, I don't just work out and work out and work out and work out and work out. And then like there's no goal. Like there's usually like a goal. Like what is the goal? And then like you work towards that. And so I apply the same thing when I think about learning, right? If I'm learning something, like I must be learning it for a reason, you know?
Right.
Otherwise, you know, unless you're in college and you have a test to pass. But like in general, like you have a thing that you want to do.
Right.
So you might be like, oh, hey, I want to build a website for, I don't know, my grandma's plant shop, right? Like, or, you know, I want to build an app, a mobile app to help me manage my money better. Or, you know what I mean? Like, oh, maybe I just have to do it for work, right? Like I have a day job and I have tasks to accomplish. I have things to learn to like accomplish these tasks, right? And so usually what I tell folks is like, well, you should usually start your strategy around like, what's the thing you want to learn?
Yeah.
So for the sake of this conversation, let's say, hey, I want to learn minimal APIs in .NET, right? I know nothing about C#. I know nothing about the web. I know nothing about programming in general.
Right.
You know, I need to learn minimal APIs, right? And so now for me, that's how I kind of help scope down how much of .NET do I need to know, right?
Right.
Because again, back in the day, like .NET was like a big old bundle of stuff, right? And then you kind of got everything at the same time. And I was like, okay, I'm doing this web stuff, but do I need to know this WinForm stuff? Or do I need to know this WCF stuff and this stuff and that stuff? And I didn't know any better, so I thought you did.
I did too.
But you don't. But again, I didn't know any better, right? But then now, because .NET is so componentized, right? Now I can just get the pieces I need. And I'm like, okay, well, I want to learn the web stuff. I'm going to download the web stuff. I'm going to look at the web docs, and there's sections in the docs specifically for that. And now I'm creating like a strategy to be like, okay, this is the thing that I want to accomplish. And I'm going to get those bits and pieces of that, you know, until I like, you know, get to whatever my goal is, right? And then we can figure out whatever else happens after that. But then now I'm looking for web resources on, you know, APIs, and I'm looking for books, and I'm looking to people to talk to, and I'm scouring GitHub, like looking for code that I could borrow, right? Just so I can learn again, like this specific thing, right? And so for me in general, I think that's a good approach to take. So I'm kind of curious about like what the rest of y'all think about, like how do you approach the process of actually focusing on a thing to learn?
I honestly think that's a really good one. And I think this is one of the things that I'm really going to ask people watching this and watching it later to, reach out in docs and help give us feedback to do this better, because I think it's one of the things we don't do really well. Yeah. You mentioned how .NET's componentized, right? We have ASP.NET Core, we have Entity Framework, we have C# language, we have runtime libraries, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the way we naturally structure our content, like I'm personally responsible for the C# stuff, right? So just the stuff that I write takes you from, I don't know C# at all, at some point, and there's some organization I still have to improve as well. But at some point, you know, or at least have access to know everything that's in the standard and the spec, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's not useful without also learning, like in your scenario where I want to build a website with minimal APIs, I've got to learn some ASP.NET Core APIs. I've got to learn Razor syntax probably at some point. I need some CSS. I'm either going to use JavaScript or TypeScript, maybe with React, maybe a different library. I'm going to pull in these new APIs. I'm going to store data somewhere to do something. So maybe that's Entity Framework. Maybe that's Cosmos DB. I don't, right?
Yeah.
And so what we're finding is we take one of these scenarios and what people really want to learn, what we have to do is we've got these sort of parallel learning paths. And what we need is a way to get people to move back and forth between them, not really lose their place, but go, okay, so now you've got enough C# syntax, you can write some code. Now learn Razor and how to put it in a web page. Learn, the ASP.NET templates and build a website. Okay. That's somebody else's dog going on.
Yeah, my dogs are going crazy too.
That's funny.
It's snowing here, so we get the snowplow to come by occasionally, and that's new and interesting for the dog.
That's funny. That's funny.
Come here. Sit.
But yeah, I know when I think about and kind of like you said, right? Like we kind of focus and we pick on a thing. And I know for you, like you said, you work on the docs and you have like some influence there over stuff. But another thing I tell folks is, in addition to like learning like the actual framework and the language and the thing that you're doing, it's also important to know, again, based on whatever your focus is, to understand like what the fundamental components of that are. So again, if we're talking about web APIs, you should probably know a little bit about HTTP, maybe like a little bit. You don't have to read the spec top to bottom, but it might be a good idea to know, well, what is a status code? Or what is a body? Or like, what are some of these things that make up, the world that I'm trying to play in, right? And now this has nothing to do with the language, and it has nothing to do with the IDE or the cloud or whatever. Right. Well, maybe not. But now it's just like, okay, the language that I'm using is helping me like manipulate this thing. You know what I mean? Like if I don't know, maybe I wanted to write my own version of Photoshop. Maybe that's the thing, right? And I might use C#, I might use Ruby, I might use whatever the case is. But at the end of the day, like the concept is, how can I manipulate these bytes to make this image, I want to crop it, I want to flip it, rotate it, distort it, whatever the case is, right? So I guess my point more so is, in learning anything too, and then in having a focus to the things that you're trying to learn, there's okay, I want to understand the mechanics of the language, but I also want to understand a little bit like the thing that I'm actually trying to manipulate a little bit, because now I find like that knowledge is transferable. You know what I mean? Like, so as I jump between language X, Y, Z, or whatever the case is, if I jump between VB and F# and C#, like the mechanics are still the same. Like the thing that I'm manipulating is constant. Right?
No, and I think this touches on another really important concept that I used when I was teaching people in person, especially beginners, because we would show somebody, we'd start with hello world and so on, and some of the beginners were just like, I need to know exactly what every symbol in this goes. Why is there an open curly here? Why is there a namespace? And we keep going, and and they could not put any detail to the side at this point, right? And say, okay, we're not going to worry about that right now.
Yeah.
But if you think about the stuff that we build and programming in general, every time you call an API that's in the .NET framework anywhere, you're pretty much going, I don't need to know the details. I expect, list.sort to sort a list as fast as it can, and I'm good, right? And, I expect string.find to find, the word I'm looking for when I'm trying to find something in search. So we have this really unique skill to be very, very detail oriented in the stuff we're trying to write, so that our code does what we want it to and does it the way we want it to do, and yet totally ignore the details on the libraries we're using, but just trust that it's going to do what it does. Yeah. Right. And you mentioned that there's really degrees all the way up and down there, right? I know some of what the HTTP codes are. I know how to set this was succeeded, or I'm going to redirect something, or, maybe I set the expired no change tag, right? For performance reasons or what have you, but I don't know everything, and this is true. Like you mentioned graphics, right? Maybe I know how to manipulate a few pixels here and there, or draw line graphics, but I really don't know how to do dekerning on fonts or whatever details are there. I trust this library to do that for me. Yeah. So it's really true that everybody is going to do that, where we have, like to Elann's point, I'm going to ask friends and colleagues, okay, I'm focused here. How do I use this minimal API thing? How do I use this, these other APIs to make them work? What protocols are happening here, right? And I think we all have to be able to lean on colleagues who are, their area of focus is adjacent to ours, but different.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So kind of parallel to that then, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what do you think are some fundamental things that like all C# specifically,
right,
developers should know?
I'm really working on that right now. So you're going to see over the next several months in the C# guide a fair amount of just reorganization. And I've been working with Mads Torgerson and Kathleen Dollard, along with other people on the compiler and language teams, to say, what would we call everyday C#? Which what we're looking at that as is the subset of C# that almost every developer uses almost every day. Okay, so like to put some obvious examples, if statements, loops, those kinds of things. Some beginning pattern matching we're thinking goes in that set, because there's a lot of
Oh,
ways
wow.
where doing some either null checks or type checks, or looking at data that came from a JSON packet to see what some properties are really fundamental things we do a lot.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Some things that we're thinking obviously don't necessarily go there. Some of the older syntax to create delegates, you're still going to see it, right? But now we'd say just make a lambda expression. Some things like, what other ones? Like there's even some of the newer features we say probably aren't everyday features. If you look at ref safety, which is a really, really powerful set of stuff to use for some really low level performance. You're not going to use that every day. You're only going to use that after I've measured my algorithm. I can see where memory allocations are taking time, and I can see how I want to change that. And now I'm, introducing these features. So it's not an everyday feature, but it's still important and still something we want to do.
Yeah.
So I think those are definitely there. And we're still going to cover those, but I'm going to put those in a different place. So it's like, okay, you should only come here if this is the problem you're having that you're trying to solve.
I like that. I think that would be so helpful. I feel like, and this is something that I've run into, is like, how do you know when you've graduated? Like, how do you know, like having those specific benchmarks where it's like, okay, this is beginning C#, that this is what you need to know the full basics of beginning C#.
Right.
Okay, now there's an intermediate level. Like, let's take it a step further. It's just like, how do you know? And I think that would be so helpful.
Okay. I think the first part is you realize that even with my job where I'm responsible for the docs, and some of that is also I'm on the ECMA C# standards committee, and we're updating the standard for newer versions of C#. And I joke that if there's anything with overload resolution, I have to look it up every time. There is no way I remember that, at least not all of the intricacies of it.
That's hilarious.
And so realize that there is almost no one who pretty much has the standard memorized, right? It's just too big of a language. So we all look stuff up when we need to. And so with that, we kind of started from there to go, well, what stuff do we just never have to look up because we just know how it works? And it's, if you're writing programs, you just know what it does. Yeah. Right. And that's the set we say is, the stuff you need to do some things with. And I'm still toying with this. I'm not sure I have every level here exactly right, but like beginning stuff to me is I can write some code that works, and it's one of the reasons I like top level statements, especially as a tool for beginners, in that there's less ceremony. I just have to focus on one concept of, you're more or less writing a script at that point, and everything else is behind the covers. And then as you start moving forward, then we'll start to add a little bit more complexity. You're going to start to define types. You're going to start to get into some of these things. And your vocabulary keeps increasing. I use the analogy around human languages, right? 4 and 5 year olds can communicate in their native language generally pretty well. They get their point across. It's not the most elegant language. It's not going to win Pulitzer Prizes, but they can get the point across. And then, as we all grow, our vocabulary increases and the usable vocabulary increases, and we have more ways to express ourselves. But that doesn't mean, anyone in between there isn't communicating or doing things effectively.
Right.
I am going to call out one of the things I see just rolling by in chat on the standard. Fully Snowball asked if it's an updated standard or if it's a standard plus deltas. Right now it's a standard plus deltas, and we keep working on that. What our intent is, so effectively what happened is work on the standard through the standardization process stopped for a few releases. And in the interim, the Microsoft spec moved forward. We worked really hard with the C#6 standard update, which happened during the C#9 timeframe. That's just how far behind we were to put those two specs back together. And there's now one standard for C#6. And then we're starting to apply all the speclets for 7 and move forward as quickly as we can. We're going more slowly right now because of how far behind we are. And yes, it's on GitHub. If you go to github.com/.net/C# standard, you can see the progress that we're making. If we look at what the team is doing and how they're writing the newer speclets, we expect to accelerate as we get going. We also made the big change in C#7 that we now maintain the standard in Markdown rather than in a Word doc, which helps us make PRs and merge things a little bit quicker. And it helps us with just moving through the process of grabbing the specs from the team and so on. So we are going to keep working on that. And in the interim, we do publish the feature specs on docs, knowing that there's some implementation details that change as things get implemented, and we find those and try to fix them quickly. But we do have a commitment to catch up, but it's not as easy as we would like.
Right. So Bill, you mentioned obviously you work on the docs team right now, right? So you create a lot of like reference documentation, but I guess also like tutorials and walkthroughs and quick starts and a variety of different types of like learning material.
Yep. Learn modules and so on too. Yep.
So if I was supposed to start learning C# today, like, I'm a new person coming in from scratch, in addition to just going to docs.microsoft.com/.net, right?
Yeah. So we rebranded. It's now learn.microsoft.com/.net.
Oh, is it? Okay. See, there you go. So you guys keep changing my stuff all the time, man.
I know.
But other than just going to the official documentation, like what are some other interesting resources maybe you've come across or maybe you created for new folks to get involved and start using .NET?
Sure. So I'll start with just the things our team creates, or our larger team. So in addition to the docs, there are learning paths on Microsoft Learn, which has now been rebranded our training. So there's training modules for learning C#, for your earlier scenario, building ASP.NET web pages with C# and then deploying them in Azure. The navigation there, we keep improving, and it is already good, and that you can start on a learning path and say, this is my goal. And, we should have modules suggested that help build toward that. Those are some really good learning materials. As I say, I'm going to keep working in docs, upgrading those journeys, and working with the Learn team. There's going to be a lot of cross-linking between, whether you want to read things on docs, do Learn modules and so on back and forth, to try as to which format works better for you, to where we were talking about different ways to learn. Honestly, I'm still going to say that the Pluralsight courses, originally written by Scott Allen, are still really, really good resources. I think they've now added, I don't know who's maintaining those now, but those have always been really high quality and really great ways to learn.
Right. So I'm on the Docs website right now.
Yep.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm on the .NET website right now.
Yep.
And in the top tab, there's this area that says Learn, right? So kind of like what you're mentioning. So there's Learn to Code C#, there's videos, there's architectural guides, and then there's courses. And as I kind of glance at it, it kind of feels like there are different levels of learning happening here, right? So as an example, if I'm a beginner, I'm probably not going to look at the architectural guide.
Yeah.
I'd agree.
Just guess, right?
Yes.
But I'm probably going to go to maybe the first one or the second one, like the beginner videos or the learn C to learn C#. Guessing based on, do I want video-based content, or I'm going to guess that this is text-based content, right? So if I click it, now like there's all these different resources. Learn C# in your own pace. We spoke about this a little while ago, right? Like those interactive experiences that exist in the browser, and I don't have to install stuff to get started using it, right? Which I think is also really cool. And like you said, like these are all on Learn, right? So I can go into Microsoft Learn and I can kind of look through some of these various, learn modules and learning paths and all these types of things for folks that are interested in learning how to get started in .NET and C#.
Right.
Now, we also had another question. I kind of wanted to
Yeah, I have a question too.
address
Maybe we
this.
have the same question.
You might. I mean, look, there's so many comments in here. But the
Oh, that's
question
awesome.
was around. Here we go. So I'd love to hear your thought about this. How does ChatGPT affect your line of work?
So
I'm kind of curious to hear. As someone that writes docs and content and stuff. Like, I'm
right.
curious.
So we have played with it a little bit, and a couple things I find really funny is if you ask it certain questions, because of where it was trained, it will come pretty close to spitting out our docs at you. Okay. Now, the good part about that is, you know, without being trained on the stuff we wrote, well, it's not going to spit out anything, right? So I think there's some interesting. It does do some really good things, and I think there's some really good. If I were in charge of ChatGPT, I think there's a few things that I would really want to see doing it. Is when it spits out answers, I would love to see it add citations for sources.
Oh,
right.
Nice.
Because
I like
you know
that.
you can ask it this detailed question and get a 200-word essay. Well, where did it get that research from? You know, like if I were doing research and I'm looking at a research paper, it's like, oh, I'm citing these sources. Okay. Who are those sources? Good, reliable? What else can I learn from those? And
yeah,
you know, and I think that's good. I do think there's the part of what I do that I really like the most is coming up with scenarios that make learning really stick. One of the ones I really like that's in docs that I can find the link for and drop in here is the one I did for pattern matching, where the scenario I put into it was, you know, you're coordinating with integrating these different sets of vehicle management systems, and you've got to construct tolls for a bridge based on, you know, like how many people are in a car, what time they're there, when they're going into or out of the city. If it's a truck, it's like how heavy it is and what time and so on. And because these were bringing in different systems, they didn't put, you know, you can't just use inheritance in a virtual function. So you're looking at different properties of these objects, and it really walks through how you would use pattern matching to solve that problem, right?
Okay.
So I really like that because it's a very compelling kind of scenario of like, oh, okay, here's why we're using this tool, and here's why the code looks better. And like there's one part toward the end where I take this whole set of chained ifs that's about 60, 70 lines long, and it turns into 12 lines of pattern matching. That not only being that much shorter, but because it's that much shorter and you're looking at the variables, it's very readable, right? So I think that kind of thing is what's really fun, and that's very creative. I'm doing another one right now. You know, I mentioned rough safety, so it's an advanced tutorial to take something that's allocating just gobs of small things. The scenario I came up with was it's a museum with some really, really detailed sensors. So it's going to see, like, has the level of oxygen or CO2 in the room changed, indicating there's an intruder, right? And, you know, temperature change and humidity change because somebody's breathing in there. And, you know, data's coming at you super, super fast, and you're allocating this and analyzing it and so on. So then how do you reduce the allocations? So the scenarios can be kind of fun to show some of the code to do that rather than just very dryly showing, oh, hey, see, I just, you know, changed this class to a struct and made it ref and, you know, so on. And then I think is another area where I don't know that ChatGPT is going to get that creative as far as that goes. But those are the things that also help people really remember the lessons. You know, it's
I think ChatGPT, what it can never do is replace like emotional intelligence. And that's something that, you know, humans are really great at. Like it's good for information and like that type of like intelligence, but not emotional intelligence.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with you. Elahn, I know you said you had a question. Did you want to?
Yeah, Bill, so my question is, what would you say to somebody who's learning C sharp and they're learning a certain topic or concept and they're wondering whether or not they should go deeper within that concept or if they should move on? Like, what would you say to that learner? Just because, for me, I've had experiences where it's like I had to tell myself, like, it's not a fail to move on from a topic, you know?
Right. Are you really interested in how it works? Right. Are you really interested in learning more about this thing? Or, like to Cecil's point earlier, talking about, hey, my goal here is to be able to build a website. Okay, if that's your goal, then at some point you're kind of going, yeah, this isn't really helping me. And at other times it's like, well, this is really, really interesting. So I'm really enjoying this. A good analogy I'll use. My middle daughter, is a violinist. So she's been taking violin lessons. She started when she was 4.
Oh,
And she now, in addition to performing, teaches. And one of the skills that she uses is a lot of times when you're trying to learn something on an instrument, there are etudes that were specifically written almost as an exercise to learn a certain technique. Okay. Or there are pieces that will say, this is the canonical piece you learn to learn, say, vibrato or shifting your hand to third position or something. And if you have a student that's like, I really just don't like this piece. Now, then her job as a teacher is then to go, okay, we're going to learn this technique. I'm going to find a different piece that helps you learn this, because there's nothing magical about this one etude. What we want to do is get you to learn how to shift your hand and, from first to third position and be in tune. So we're going to find a different piece that has that in it that you can work on, that you like, and then you'll practice it more. So I think there's a lot to be said for being able to find compelling scenarios or compelling reasons why you want to learn something more deeply. Right. And to Elann's question, if, learning more about the performance of collections is boring, then you've learned all you need to know about that for what you want to do, and go learn the things you want to do. And if, doing, I personally, if you look at some of the UIs I designed, they're really bad, but I don't get satisfaction out of making it look much better. And that's on me, really. But other people that I do work with, when we're doing something that has to have a UI element, it's like, wow, that looks great. That's cool. I like it so much better now. I'm glad you did instead of me. But, so I think there's a lot to be said about just knowing what motivates you. And then if it's a skill you really, really need, let's find another way to learn that skill you really need that's more motivating. And if it's just not that interesting, then move on to something that really is.
yeah. I think that's one of the opportunities you have, like when you work in a team of people and everyone could kind of come with their strengths, their preferences, and kind of, we'll create a thing together that makes sense. Because again, just like Bill, I don't really care what it looks like. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I'll talk a lot about like what the backend looks like. I care about like, queuing systems and sending messages and the microservice stuff. And if you, whatever thing you want to use to make it look pretty and change the colors and stuff like that, like, I know that's not my strong suit, but I appreciate you putting in the effort to do it.
Yeah.
And then now as a team, we could find like that middle ground where we can plug in together. We can both make both of our worlds talk together. You know what I mean? So I think that, again, like, the benefit of working in a team where everyone can kind of just come together and find like that level of cohesion is important.
Right.
I one thing that just came to mind, and it's kind of like a realization. It's like, yeah, like when you're in school and you're learning certain subjects, you don't really have a choice. Like you have to learn whatever the teacher is like teaching you. And I think it's like when it comes to learning how to code, especially like if you're on that self-taught journey, is that you do have the choice to choose like what you want to know and what you want to learn and what motivates you, what interests you, and like whatever keeps your fire burning. So I think that is something that just came to mind for me, is just like yeah, when you're learning how to code, it is like a huge, like expansive, like just like so many different paths and so much information, and it's like you get to choose.
Right. And I think this is one of the things that I think is lacking in at least America's educational system at times, in terms of how we explain respect for the things you're not necessarily interested in. And to our previous discussion, I am not super interested in building really, really awesome UIs, but I do really respect the people who are good at it. And I try to really listen to them and, learn from them enough to, suck a little less, and really respect when they make the stuff I'm doing look a lot better. And I think at times when we're learning the things the teacher is forcing us to learn, sometimes we lose the sight of the fact that these are really important things. They just don't happen to be what we're compelled to do. And we should respect the people who are compelled to do really, really awesome work in those spaces. And I think that's kind of where I think we need to get as humans in general, whether that's coding or we're living in society and recognizing other skills.
So like ownership over your education.
Yeah.
And allowing it to be okay, like, hey, yeah, that doesn't really interest me. Like just because it doesn't interest me, it doesn't make me less of a developer.
Right.
Because I think there's a little bit of imposter syndrome too with that. It's like, I have to know it all.
And the same way that just because it doesn't interest you doesn't mean it's not important to the thing we're trying to build as a team, right?
Right.
And I think both of those are equally strong skills to have.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we can get out of like an environment like that too is not just hey, I'm getting to focus on a thing, but then also as I become really good at the thing I'm focusing on, like we need to remember to like pass it backwards, right? Like we need to pass it back. We need to teach other people as well.
Yes.
Because for me, I learn better when I teach other people.
Yeah.
You know
Same.
what I mean? I feel like, the tool set gets a little bit sharper when you do that. But then also too, you're also helping empower like everyone else around you, right? And then again, you create like that environment of learning. So again, going back earlier to when we were talking about like available resources for learning, again, when I started, like it was me and the book, right? There was nowhere to go, at least, at the time, right? Like, but now like we can go to meetups, we can go to Discord, we could be on things like this, but we could talk with people and share information and perspective. And then now like our collective brain power kind of just increase at the same time, right?
It does.
It's just again, like this is for me, it's just like this is like a plus one of the types of tools that you can learn to learn something new, but then also figure out, kind of like Elahn was asking, like what's the thing that I want to focus on? Like, and if I don't know, then the best thing I could do is kind of, I'll just look around at everything, right? And then kind of see what sticks and what feels good. And then, just kind of continuing diving into that.
I would agree. And I think, I know a few of the people that do regular Twitch streams. Jeff Fritz is one. Layla Porter does one. They both do a really, really good job of they're working through building something and talking through how they're designing it and how they're adding pieces to it. And I think that's a really good way to get your head into thinking about how to build code. Even if the particular problem might not be the most interesting for you, it gets you thinking about, here's the problem, here's how I'm going to express it in code. And yeah, now that works. Those are useful. And like this conversation here is almost like the hallway track at a conference.
At a conference, yeah.
When I walk back and forth through the halls, like catch bits of a conversation, participate for a while it's interesting, then maybe move on as the conversation, drifts to a topic that's just not one that I'm super interested in, and go find a new group and so on. And those kinds of things also really help. Just turn your brain on. Yeah.
So
one of the
I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
I was going to say one of the challenges that I had to overcome when I first started learning how to code, is kind of like this feeling of guilt for looking at other people's code. I know it sounds crazy, like looking back at it, but it was like this whole idea, like when you look up to developers, like, you know, and they're producing this content, and you're like, okay, I want to become a developer. What do I need to do? One of the biggest things that I've heard was that you have to be a good problem solver. And it's like you have to be able to problem solve using the basic concepts you've learned. But one of the things that I've realized is that there are easier ways to do things with newer concepts. So like LINQ, like I remember just being so stuck in a project that I was building, and I wanted to figure it out on my own. And then after Google searching, I realized there was a way more easier way to do something using LINQ. But I just felt like I should have had gotten it by myself, like without having to look at other people's code. And I think it was just a misconception. But like, what do you think about that? Like, have you ever felt like that?
Oh yeah, I look at other people's code all the time. I mean, yeah, that's. I think, you know, we're taught at a young age in a lot of education systems, you know, not to copy. Copying is bad. Plagiarism is bad. Even worse, don't copy things. But also reading how somebody else solved a problem is one really valid way to learn, whether it's in a book, you know, I mean, so how is reading code on screen that you Googled different than, you know, Cecil saying I had the big book, which I'm sure had code samples in it, right? There's no difference there at all in terms of what you're doing. And what I always told students on anything like that is if you copied code from Stack Overflow or wherever you Googled it, make sure you understand it. And if you read it and understand it, okay, then what you did was research, right? You searched, you found someone published a solution, and then you used it. That's awesome, right? And I think that's, you know, whereas whether it's working through a tutorial or anything, you know, we encourage students not necessarily to just hit, you know, here's this code, copy, paste, it runs, and you're not thinking through what the code does that you're copying and pasting. You know, so one technique we may say is instead of, you know, hitting the copy and paste buttons, type it in. And that's only because just like repeating it is actually learning, right? No. But there's other ways to do it. And if that works better for you to, you know, read it, try to understand it, that works well too. But I think the important part is that you're making the searching and you're looking for answers is also turning your brain on. You know, and some of that is, you know, we probably all know that there are things in the internet that aren't correct. So you may have Googled something and found something that's not really useful.
Yeah. I think we just have to be practical about how we use those resources, right? And I guess I'm looking in the chat right now, you know, this person's asking like, what's the license that governs code on Stack Overflow? I'm not saying that we should answer it, but like it makes me think. You go to Stack Overflow, I go to GitHub, I look on someone's blog posts, right? And now I'm trying to like, oh, okay, well, they solved this problem this way, and I want to adapt it into my solution. You know what I mean? Probably not going to copy and paste it the same way because I know they probably have different naming conventions and naming all kinds of things. But at the same time, too, you know, I think there's a point where it's just inspiration, and then there's a point that it gets to just exploitation, right? Like I've just copied your stuff and moving over. And so as we're learning things, I think I want to use this to just say, like, we have to just be careful with what that level is, right? And kind of like what Bill says, some things are wrong. And if you copy paste something from GitHub and it's wrong, or wherever you got it from and it's wrong, like who are you going to blame for that, right?
Right.
You know, who's responsible for, you know, that fallacy?
Right. And, you know, to the question, I'd have to look it up, honestly. I do know for our docs, all the code samples are MIT licensed. and all of the words are Creative Commons too. So you have rights to use those things in different ways. Yeah, and I think as you say, the important part is, are you actually using it, making use of it, and possibly even cite it, right? If it's in a program and it's like, okay, I got this algorithm from here. If someone wants to figure out why or go deeper into it, there's the citation. Those are reasonable too.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the last things I want us to talk about, because Bill, I know you're leaving soon. You gotta, we have real work we have to go do. So we talked about docs, right? Mm-hmm. What is your feeling about like conferences? I feel like we touched on it a little bit, but like, what's your feeling, particularly for new folks, going to conferences, going to in-person places, meetups, and things like that?
Mm-hmm. I think it's really, really important, to the extent that you can. And, like if I think of some of the really big name conferences, those can be rather expensive, especially if travel's involved, and also may not be practical depending on life situations and so on. But you can look just about anywhere and find a meetup on different topics. .NET Foundation does try to keep track of the ones that are .NET related, which I think is the page you've got up right now. So it's a place where you can go and also ask questions.
Right.
And I will say that just about everyone that I've ever met is happy to answer questions that are sincerely asked. And that's how I learned when I started. And, now I'm more often answering than asking. And I'm more than happy to do that anytime anybody sees me at a conference. And if you go to, there's also really, really good community-run conferences where the cost is a lot less. They're probably more local. Really good way to meet people in your community who are also learning. And, you can expand your knowledge there. And I would say if you go, really try to be present and engaged as much as you can, whether it's in sessions where you're actively listening, or, we kind of mentioned talking in this hallway track where you're engaged in conversations.
Right.
The one thing I wouldn't recommend is go to a conference and be checking your email and working on stuff in sessions and so on, because then you're really not getting what you should be out of it. But if you're engaged with the people that you're trying to have conversations with and engaged, trying to learn from them, and even for beginners, you're going to be spreading some knowledge as well. Especially there's people who, I talk to who are noticeably younger and learning in a different way. And I get a lot of good ideas from them in terms of how to explain things now, and, why the challenges we may have had when I was first learning are different than the challenges people have now learning. And I need to adapt how I'm teaching to match that.
Yeah.
So I learn as much as I get when I'm, when I'm answering questions at conferences.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Bill, I think we're going to wrap because, again, I think we're at time. And again, I know you do have to go. My last question for you, right? So if folks want to reach out to you or, just kind of check in and see what you're up to, where are some places that they could find your web?
So I'm still on the Crazy Bird app, at Bill Wagner on Twitter. And at least for the moment, I plan on staying there.
Okay.
If you read any of the .NET docs, especially in the area on C#, if you have any questions, there's a feedback button at the bottom of the page that lets you create a GitHub issue. Mm-hmm. In the section on C#, I'll automatically get tagged and I'll see that. Okay. And then we'll take it from there. Those are probably the two best ways. Email, it's wiwagn@microsoft.com. And other than that, if you see me at a conference, by all means, grab me and let's have a chat.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Bill, again, thank you so much. Really appreciate you making some time to come hang out with us. And maybe later on when, that project you said you're working on with the docs is out, maybe we can have you come back on and you could show us some of the cool work that you've been up to.
There are some cool things we're trying to do. All right. Awesome. Thank you very much, Cecil and Elahn.
I appreciate it.
Yes,
Bye, everyone.
thank
Thank you
you.
all again for watching, and we'll be back sometime next week. So make sure you click the like button and the subscribe button and turn on the bell for notifications and all that other cool stuff that YouTube people say.
Yep.
We will see you next time on Inside.net. Thank you so much.
Bye,
everybody.
guys.
Wow.